Hey everyone, in this section we look at the neoclassical perspective, which focuses on the long-run potential gross domestic product. We can have short-run economic fluctuations, but in the long run, with flexible prices and wages, we go back to full employment gross domestic product. We have flexible prices and wages in the neoclassical model and fixed prices and wages in the Keynesian model. We have two building blocks of in the neoclassical model. Number one, potential gross domestic product determines the size of the economy. Potential gross domestic product can increase, if it increases, the output definitely goes up. Number two, wages and prices can adjust in a flexible manner so that the economy goes back to potential gross domestic product. That means the wages and prices can increase or can go down. The potential gross domestic product, there is a definition here. This is the level of output that an economy can produce using all its resources. This is also called full employment gross domestic product and is associated with zero cyclical unemployment, or we can also say natural rate of unemployment. Looking at this tool of the neoclassical model, we have a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. If the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, the potential GDP increases. The long-run aggregate supply curve, each of them is associated with a potential GDP. So this LRAS, or long-run aggregate supply curve, shifts to the right because of increase in productivity, also due to improved technology, better resources, so on and so forth. We have flexible prices and wages in the neoclassical model, and this will help us understand what happens when aggregate demand shifts to the right and the real GDP is greater than potential gross domestic product. Let's go and take a look at this graphs here. I really want to reproduce this graph so that it becomes easier for students to follow through. I will go and draw this long-run aggregate supply curve, and the output associated with long-run aggregate supply curve is always called the potential gross domestic product. I know I keep repeating myself, I just want you to get it. Now let's draw a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. What are we missing here? We are missing the upward sloping aggregate or short-run aggregate supply curve. Initial intersection is at point E0. At point E0, the potential gross domestic product is 500. We get this from the long-run aggregate supply curve, and this is also equal to the real gross domestic product. The real gross domestic product we get at the intersection of aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve. Now, let's say something happened that has shifted the aggregate demand curve to the right. By something we mean any of the components of aggregate demand curve increasing If any of this increases, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And over here we have a new point of intersection, which is E1. At this point of intersection, we have the real gross domestic product as 510, which is greater than 500, because only the aggregate demand curve is shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve. This is the real, this is not the potential gross domestic product. Now, this is a short-run equilibrium. So what we are seeing here is point 0 is my initial equilibrium point. Point E1 is short run, and this point E1 cannot be sustained for long because we are producing over our or more than our potential gross domestic product. If I compare the vertical axis, I would see the prices definitely went up from 120 to 125, or what I just want to say here is because we have flexible prices, the prices are allowed to increase, unlike the Keynesian model where prices were not allowed to go up. Now, what happens when prices goes up? When prices goes up, workers are going to ask for higher wages, and the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. I have another equilibrium point here. Let me use this black marker to make things distinct. The new equilibrium point is E2, and the prices went up again. In this model, the wages are allowed to go up. The wages went up because the prices went up and workers were demanding higher wages. So we have point E2, which is a long run equilibrium point, and we are back to the potential gross domestic product. So we can have flexible prices, flexible wages, and in the long run we are back to the potential GDP, but only the prices goes up in the long run. Alright, I'm going to look at the next graph really quickly. So over here, unlike an increase in aggregate demand, we had a decrease in aggregate demand. So I'm just replicating the graph which is provided already in this slide. So these are all the initial points, so the initial graphs, my bad. So the potential GDP is 500. Now something happened that shifted the aggregate demand curve to the left. By something we mean any of the component of aggregate demand curve went down, and this caused the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. We have another point of equilibrium here, which is E1, and the output at point E1 is less than the potential gross domestic product. So 450 is my real gross domestic product, 500 is the potential gross domestic product. If I compare points E0 to E1, looks like the price went down along with the output which also went down. So I have prices which went down, and we have flexible prices in this model. When prices goes down, wages are also gonna go down. What happens when wages goes down? When wages are down, it's cheaper to produce more goods, and the aggregate supply curve is gonna shift to the right. So I have S1 shifting to the right here. I have another point of equilibrium, and this point of equilibrium is E1, and the prices are down even further, but we are back to the full employment level of gross domestic product, or the potential gross domestic product. Okay, that's all with the neoclassical model. Thank you very much. Hope this makes sense.